Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel. We'll start with the Mishnah on the bottom of daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. Hareini Nazir l'chsheyeh li ben. He takes upon himself a Nazirus, which will be chal when his wife gives birth to a ben. Now, the word ben can be interpreted in two ways. It could be very specific, and it's a reference to a ben zachar, or it could be more general, any child. However, the Mishnah assumes that when a person accepts upon himself Nazirus, it's a special hodah to Hashem for giving him a male child. V'nolad lo ben hareis Nazir. The Gemara is going to ask, what's the chiddush here? Of course, he was Mekayim the Tanai. The Tanai was fulfilled, and he had a ben zachar. However, nolad lo bas tumtum v'androgynous eino Nazir. And here there's a tremendous chiddush, because the assumption is that an androgynous has both simone zachrus and nakvus, and his status or her status is that of a suffix. But the Mishnah holds, apparently, like that shita in the Tanoim, which we'll see Rabbi Yehuda's shita, that you cannot assume that a person wants to accept himself upon himself Nazirus mitzad suffix. He wants a vadai. Tumtum is also a suffix. And even though later on we might clarify, after we open up that membrane that's blocking, that he's really a zachar, but nevertheless, at the moment of Leda, it was a suffix, and therefore I know Nazir. Now the Mishnah continues, Im Omar l'chsheyeh li Vlad, but if he uses a more generic term, he doesn't say Ben, but rather Vlad, is then the Mishnah's Machadesh, which the Gemara is going to ask, what's the Chiddush here? Afilu nolad lo Ben tumtum v'androgynous, either a Ben, or a Bas, or a tumtum, or an androgynous, all the above, hareis Nazir. That's a kiyum of his Tanai. Tosfos is bothered by the very concept of Tanai with regard to Nazirus, because we have a principle called Milsa de Lesa b'shlichus Lesa b'Tanai. You can't send a person as a shliach to observe Nazirus for you. It's a mitzvah shebegufo, and therefore it should not lend itself to Tanai. And Tosfos answers because there is one dimension of Nazirus that does lend itself to shlichus and therefore to Tanai, and that's the havas karbonos. You could send a shliach to bring the karbonos. Now the Mishnah continues, and here we're on the top of Daf Yud Gimel, today's Daf. He said, Areini Nazir l'chsheyeh li Vlad v'hi pila ishto. Now, in this case, even though he said Vlad, which could include male, female, androgynous, tumtum, and so forth, but nevertheless, it means a ben kayoma. However, if she miscarried, then he's not a Nazir. It could be that this Vlad is not a Vlad shel kayoma, and therefore the Nazirus wasn't chal. But once again, we get into the question of suffix. So Rabbi Shimon, he disagrees, Yomi, and we'll see exactly Rabbi Shimon's solution to this problem of suffix, but nevertheless he holds that there is Nazirus in a suffix situation. The obvious question is, why didn't Reb Shimon and his view express itself in the Reisha of the Mishnah? And it could be in the Reisha of the Mishnah that where he says that he wants a Vlad, a Ben, in the Reisha of the Reisha, even Reb Shimon would agree that he really wants a Ben and only a Ben. But here, in this case, he had a suffix ben kayoma, suffix ena ben kayoma. So Reb Shimon says, Yomar, the Nazirus is chal mi suffix, and now he has a problem of karbonos, because you can't bring a carbon mi suffix, it's a suffix chulin lazara. So what does he do? He makes it Tanai. He says, Im haya, if the Vlad that my wife gave birth to was a ben kayoma, hareini Nazir v'chova, then I'm bringing these karbonos as karbonos chova. I was a full-fledged Nazir, and I have to therefore bring my karbonos. The imlav, but if on the other hand, the Vlad was not a ben kayoma, Harani Nazir Nidava. I'm going to accept upon myself now a Nazirus B'Nidava. In other words, I'm not mechuyev because my neder, because there's a tzad to say that the Vlad was not a ben kayom, but rather was a nefel. But just in case, I'm going to offer to be a nazir misafek. Now, why does he need to make such a t'nai? According to Rabbi Shimon, that if the neder won't be chal, then he's being mischayev to nazirus of an adava. What does he gain by that? After all, according to Rabbi Shimon, let him go through the nazirus of a suffix. But the point is, and that's what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us, that if he doesn't make this t'nai, he will never be able to bring his karbanos, as we said, because perhaps the nazirus was not chal, and he wasn't chayiv to bring these karbanos, he's bringing chulav azara. And that would mean that misafek he could never bring his carbon. He's going to be asur begiluach beyayin ubetuma liolam for the rest of his life, because there's no hafkas nazirus. You cannot terminate nazirus without bringing your karbanos. He can't bring his karbanos. However, now he could bring his karbanos because it makes a t'nai that maybe it'll be a nidava. Now, the problem here that the Rishonim raises is that a Nazir, when he completes his Nazirus, he brings 3 karbanos, a chatos, ol, and a shlamim. And it's true that the chatos cannot come as a suffix. There's no such thing as a chatos without a chova, but in the case of an ola, which can come benedava, and a shlamim, which can come benedava, he could bring these karbanos misafek. And he doesn't have to accept another Nazirus, but on this very Nazirus, he could say that if the Vlad was not a Vlad ben Kayom, and if I wasn't Chayv in Nazirus, let the Shlom and the Ola that I'm bringing now at the termination of my Nazirus be a Nidava. And apparently, the conclusion that we want to derive is that one carbon or 2 karbanos out of the 3 are not sufficient to complete his nazirus. Although this is against the Gemara later on at Daf Memhei, the Gemara establishes that one of the 3 karbanos is sufficient, but that's only b'di'evid. L'chatchila, he's not megalech, he doesn't terminate his nazirus until he's makriv all 3 karbanos. So in order to cover his bases on a l'chatchila basis, he makes this t'nai. Now what happens if his wife gives birth to a twin that was conceived together with this Vlad that was miscarried? Chazra v'yolda, now she had another Vlad, and this one, Baruch Hashem, was a ben kayoma. Harei Nazir. Now for sure he's a Nazir, because he accepted upon himself an Nazirus al Tanai, Hareni Nazir l'sheyeli Vlad, and he has a Vlad. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yomar, he should declare im harishon ben kayoma, harishon chova. He started being noeg Nazirus based on the first Vlad, and that was a Nazirus shel chova if the Vlad was a ben kayoma. If on the other hand, the Vlad was not, and vizo, and now he's bringing a second Nazirus, a second carbon Nazirus, Nidava. Why? Because he was Yotzei his chova with the first set of karbanos, the first Nazirus, because it turned out to be a Vlad Kayoma. He doesn't know that. V'im lav, but if Klapei Shmaya Galia, that up in the heavens they know that the first Vlad was not a Ben Kayoma, then a Rishon, the first Niug of Nazirus for Rishona, that was a Nidava, because I wasn't obligated because it was not a Vlad Kayoma, and therefore there was no Kiyama Tanai. But Zu, now the Nazirus that I'm being noig, now that my wife gave birth to a Vadai, Ben Kayoma Chova. Now the Gemara is going to go through the Mishnah step by step and ask what the Chiddush is in each bava of the Mishnah. Hi, my lemema. We start with the Reisha. Hareni Nazir sheyeli ben v'nolo ben harezen Nazir. Why not? What's the Chiddush here? And the Gemara says, you're right, there's no Chiddush in the Reisha mishum Seifa. The Reisha is only an introduction to the Seifa. And what's the Seifa? His wife gave birth to a bas, or a tumtum, or an androgynous, Eino Nazir. In other words, he made it tonight that he should have a ben, and he wants to have a ben vadai. And then he becomes a Nazir, but not a bas, and certainly not a bas because he was makabel and Nazir, so tonight that he would have a ben. And not even if his wife gives birth to a tumtum androgynous. So the Gemara argues that interpretation of the Sefer is also pshita. What was the havamina? That his Nazirus would be chal if his wife didn't give birth to a ben. Ma'odetema, I would have thought that the word ben could take on a different meaning. L'she'evne hu dekamar. In other words, all I need is that my progeny will continue through the generations. And whatever Vlad I'll have, that's called a ben miloshen binyan, that I've built up a family. On the other hand, we thought that ben meant a ben zachar. And that's the kamashmon delo, that he didn't mean binyan, l'she'evne, which would include a bas, a tumtum, and androgynous, and therefore there would be a kiyama tonight, but rather he meant specifically a ben. Now we go on to the next part of the Mishnah. V'im amar l'sheyeli Vlad, again the Gemara has pshita. We don't need a chiddush that the word Vlad includes a bas, a tumtum, and androgynous. Ma'odetema would have raised the possible thought. Vlad de michshav beini inshi be'inon. When he says almanas sheyeli Vlad, he means a Vlad that has a certain chashivus. We can call it a Vlad gomor. In other words, people, the onlooker, the spectator, will see this as a regular Vlad, and it's got to be with michshav. Michshav means with chashivus. And the people will understand that what he meant was a ben, a dafka ben, not a bas, and certainly not a tumtum or an androgynous. Now, when I say spectator, when I look here into the Mefarshim, they say it's not just the spectator, it's that this individual might have had in mind a Vlad of Chashivus, Kamash Malon. That's the Chiddush Van Mishnah, that the word Vlad is an all-inclusive generic term for any prodigy, any children. The Mishnah continues, Hipila Ishto, Eino Nazir. If he knew that the Vlad was a Vlad Kayama, a Ben Kayama, a viable being, then his Tanai would be fulfilled. But in this case, he doesn't know that the Vlad that she gave birth to was indeed a viable Vlad because the Vlad didn't live. So the Gemara says, Man Ktanila. Who is the Shita that assumes that when a person accepts Nazirus, it's got to be a Nazirus Vadai? He's not interested in a Nazirus Suffolk. And therefore, in a case of Hipila Ishto, he's not a Nazir, he doesn't even have a din of a Suffolk Nazir. Rabbi Yehuda the Krihu. This is Rabbi Yehuda that we learned at Avches, when a person declared already Nazir al-Manah Shiyah Kri Zeh Me'akur. And now we look at the Kri, and guess what? It was stolen, it was lost, it was destroyed. And there's no way of knowing whether or not for sure we can guarantee that this Kri, this pile of Tvua, had in it a massive amount called Me'akur. And in such a case, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that it's not a Nazirus at all, because he never accepted upon his Nazirus in a suffix situation. In other words, when he accepted his Nazirus, he wasn't interested in being a Nazir on a suffix, because being Nazir on a suffix is a very complicated business. And the Gemara later on at Daf Lamed Beis quotes Rabbi Yehuda in the case. So the first case that we have, as we said before, is on Daf Ches, where we could never know whether that Kri had a Mea Kur or not because it was lost. And there the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and he says that there is a Chalos Nazirus in this case because Adam Nichnas L'Safek, a person would be Makabel on himself Nazirus, even if he's never going to know for sure, for certain, whether he's a Nazir. But the Gemara on Daf Lamed Beis has a different case. And there too the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda. Shnaim shayu holchem b'derech. They saw a person coming in their direction. And one of these two people who were walking declares Hareini Nazir shezeh ploni. Because this fellow that we're looking at, his name is John Paul Jones. His friend says the exact opposite, Hareini Nazir she'ein zeh ploni. And Rabbi Yehuda paskins that neither of them have a valid Kabbalas Nazirus, because Nazirus requires hafla. Hafla means definite, certainty. Now, it's interesting that the Gemara here quotes Rabbi Yehuda from Daf Ches and not the Rabbi Yehuda of Daf Lamed Beis. And the reason for that is because our Mishnah, which paskins that Im Yolda Ishto Zachar Harei Nazir, and it would seem that Rabbi Yehuda holds that there's no Nazirus unless it's Hafla. And since we don't know whether she's going to give birth to a Zachar, and his Nazirus was questionable when he accepted upon himself, then it's quite possible that such a Nazirus would not be Chal. And that would be Rabbi Yehuda on Daf Lamed Beis Amid Beis. Rabbi Yehuda on Daf Ches, on the other hand, is talking about a case where the very essence of his of his Tanai was a suffix, meaning he had a Vadai Kabbalas Nazirus, but he was told it on a Tanai, and now we don't know, and we cannot know and determine whether the Tanai was Mekuyim or not. And that's exactly parallel to our case of Hipila Ishto, and therefore the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda de Krihu, because here too, in the case of a person who accepts upon himself Nazirus al Tanai, the question is we don't know whether the Tanai was Mekuyim, and that's Rabbi Yehuda de Kri, where we don't know whether the Kri had Me'akur or did not, and therefore we say that even though he was Makabel Nazirus, but the Nazirus is not going to be Chal Misafa. The Mishnah quotes Reb Shimon as the dissenting view, Omer Yomar, and he should set up this Tanai, Im Hoya ben Kayoma Hareini Nazir Chova, V'im Lav Hareini Nazir Nidava. Boy Minei Rabbi Abba Mirav Huna, a person declares Hareini Nazir L'Sheyeli Ben, V'ipila Ishto. So we don't know whether or not the Vlad that she gave birth to was a Vlad Shel Kayoma, and the Nazirus is Chal, or it was a Nefel, and the Nazirus is not Chal. But nevertheless, he went ahead, V'hifrish Karban, he designated Behemos as a Karban on the Tanai, that at the end of his Nazirus, he would bring these animals as Karbanos of Siyum Nazirus. But then Chazra v'yolda. On that very same day, his wife gave birth to another child, a twin of the first one, and it turns out the second child is a ben kayama. So Rabbi Abba asks the following: Mao, what's the din? Should we say that since the second one was a ben kayama, it proves biologically that the first one was also ben kayama, and therefore Lamafreya we understand that he was a Nazir, and therefore when the kedusha was chal on the carbon, he can bring those karbanos, those behemoths as karbanos. So if you say no, maybe even though they're twins, they're not identical twins, and the first was an Eno ben Kaim, he was a Nefel, and the Nazirus wasn't chal, and if the Nazirus wasn't chal, the afresh of the carbon would not be valid. And the Gemara later on is going to ask what's the difference exactly, whether it's valid or not, and we'll get into some of the laws of Kodshim about Gizav Avoda. But in any event, the Gemara tries to clarify the suffix of Rabbi Abba. Aliva deman, according to which shita between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Abba mistapik? Aliva Rabbi Shimon mighty boile. If Rabbi Abba is building himself on the shita of Shimon, then what's the suffix? Ha'amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that in a case of suffix, like for example, almanas she ishti tolid ben, and it turned out to be a nefel. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that he has to be noeg nazirus mi suffix nazirus lahachmir, and therefore certainly when he was mafresh the carbon after his wife miscarried, that hafrasha and that kedusha is chal mi suffix, because that's exactly what he's required to do. The Ella, but rather we have to assume by process of elimination that Rabbi Abba was mistapik according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? I'll leave it to Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Safik Nazirus L'Hakel Mai. What's the status now of this carbon that he was mafresh? Shall we say it's kadosh? Why? Because the second Leda proves Lamafreya that the first Leda was a Ben Kayama. Oh, low kadosh, shall we say no? These two twins are different, one physiologically, one from the other. And even though the second Vlad that she gave birth to was a Vlad Shel Kayama, we don't know, and we still are in doubt in Suffolk whether or not the first Vlad was a Vlad Shena Shel Kayama, which would mean that the Nazirus would not be Chal. And that's the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, that there's no Nazirus mi Suffolk, and therefore he was never Chayv in a carbon, and therefore that frush is not valid. So the Gemara asks, "My nafkamina," a very naive question. Well, what difference does it make whether or not he was Yotze Misafik or not, whether or not it's Kaddish or not? And the Gemara says that there's no nafkamina as far as Havas Karban. We're not going to say that if the Rishon was a Ben Kayoma, then the Behema has Kedushas Karban, he could bring it on the Mizbeach. Because there's another side to say that the Vlad was not a Ben Kayama, and he's not chayav in Karbonis Nazirus, and he cannot achieve Kapara through that Karban, and therefore he's not going to bring the Karma. So what's the difference here as far as the status of the Behema if in any event he can't bring it on the Mizbeach? So what din or nafkamina is Yotze from the fact that it's a suffix? I think we're answers l'gizaso v'lavod bo. As far as the Isur Giza of a carbon, in other words, once a person is mafresh a carbon, that behema is now generates an Isur Giza. You're not allowed to shear off its wool, v'lavod bo, and you're not allowed to do any work with that carbon. So it turns out like this: we don't know if the kedusha was chal on the behema. If we assume that possibly the first Vlad was a Vlad she'eno shel kayomas and nefel, and therefore the kedushas carbon will be chal misafek, because maybe the first Vlad, lemafreya, we clarify, was a Vlad shel kayom, and therefore we have to be noig lechumra as far as the Isur Giza Avoda is concerned. And the Gemara obliges with teikuv. Boy minei ben rechumi l'me'abaye. What's the din if a person says Hareini Nazir l'chshiyeheli ben? V'shama chavero. So as Reuven opens up with the declaration that I'll become a Nazir when I'll have a son, Shimon overhears Reuven, v'amar, and he says v'alai, meaning that same neder that Reuven took, I'm taking. Mahu. There are two ways of interpreting it. One is adibure mashma, that v'alai means he's accepting exactly the Naziris of Reuven, which would mean that Shimon is saying that if Reuven's wife gives birth to a son, he'll become a Nazir. Or should we say no, agufe mashma. He's not referring to the Kiyum Tanai of Reuven having a son, but rather he's coming to make himself equal in terms of the kind of a Tanai that he heard from Reuven. And he's being masnal atzmo, he's taking a Tanai on himself that if his wife will give birth to a son, he will be a Nazir. He's not being told in Naziris on the Leda of the Ben of Reuven, but rather on the Leda of his own wife. And the Gemara is going to build one suffix on top of another on top of another. Imtim Salomar, if you're going to come to the possible conclusion, which we don't know, that when he says V'yam alai, he means agufe mashma, meaning he's equating himself to his friend, and just like if his friend accepted a conditional Naziris, if his friend wife would give birth, so too he's accepting Naziris if his wife will give birth to a son. Now comes suffix number 2. Amar Hareini Nazir l'sheyeli ben. Reuven says the same Kabbalah. V'shama chaver v'yomar va'ani. Instead of saying v'olai, he said v'ani, and v'ani is different than v'olai. Mao. Shall we say that v'ani has the same status as v'olai or not? Anafshei ka'amar. And once again, he's saying v'ani, that if my wife will give birth to a son, then I am mischayev to be a Nazir, and therefore alai and ani are equal. O dilma, perhaps hachikama. Maybe the word ani has a different intention, a different meaning than the word alai. And rechimna loch kavasech. I love you like I love myself. Vani. It's like v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And just like you're being noder Naziris, that'll be chal when you'll have a son, I love you so much that I too will become a Nazir when you have a son. He says the following in the note here, quoting the Mefaresh and other Rishonim. He says, "Kimosh ata kibalta Naziris l'shem hoda v'shevach l'kadosh baruch hu mitoch she'ata sameach b'tova she'asa imcha v'zika oscha b'ben kach ani gam ani ohev oscha kamoscha v'gam ani etein shevach v'hoda l'kadosh baruch hu l'tova she'asa imcha, because you were zocher to have a ben v'kabel naziris al kach." My expression of hodat HaKadosh Baruch Hu for your simcha, for your having a son, is my Kabbalas Naziris. My Kabbalas Naziris is a Shevach V'Hodoy, because you were Zocha, you, my beloved friend, like David and Yonasan. Now the Gemara has a third suffix. Imtim Tzalomar, called the Anpei Sifala Milsa. Okay. So now we're going to see the next suffix that's built on this suffix.